The morning of July 7, 1942, Commander Eddie Sanders stood beside a peculiar aircraft at Naval Air Station San Diego and wondered if he was about to die testing the enemy's greatest weapon. The Zero fighter before him, captured intact in the Aleutian Islands just weeks earlier, represented everything American naval aviators had learned to fear in the skies over the Pacific. It had terrorized pilots from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, turning experienced flyers into statistics with an agility that seemed to defy physics itself. Sanders ran his hand along the Zero's aluminum skin, still bearing the faded red Hinomaru, the rising sun insignia of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The aircraft looked fragile, almost delicate, like something that belonged in a pre-war air show, rather than the brutal machinery of industrial warfare. And yet this machine, and thousands like it, had achieved air superiority across half an ocean, had shot down aircraft that American engineers had promised were invincible. What Sanders didn't know, what no American pilot yet understood, was that he was about to discover the Zero's fatal flaw, a weakness so fundamental that it would transform American fighter tactics within weeks and help shift the balance of air power in the Pacific theater. The discovery wouldn't come from careful engineering analysis or wind tunnel testing. It would come from one seemingly ridiculous test, performed at speeds the Zero's designers never intended their aircraft to reach in combat maneuvering. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But to understand the significance of what Sanders was about to learn, we need to understand what American naval aviators believed about the Zero in the summer of 1942, and more importantly, what they had been forced to learn through blood and burning wreckage over the previous 8 months. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero had entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1940, and from its first combat missions over China, it had established a reputation that bordered on mythological. By the time Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Zero had accumulated a combat record that stunned Western military observers who paid attention. In one engagement over Chongqing, China, in September 1940, 13 Zeros had engaged 27 Soviet-made I-15 and I-16 fighters defending the city. The result, all 27 Chinese aircraft shot down, with 0 Japanese losses. American intelligence had reports of these engagements. They had photographs of the Zero. They even had detailed warnings from Claire Chennault, the American advisor to the Chinese Air Force, who had seen the Zero in action and tried desperately to communicate its capabilities to Washington. In a report sent in October 1940, Chennault had written that the Zero could outclimb, outmaneuver, and outfight any fighter aircraft in the world today. His warnings were filed away, largely dismissed by American aviation experts who believed, with the absolute certainty that comes from never having faced the enemy in combat, that American fighters were inherently superior. This belief rested on several pillars of conventional wisdom that dominated American aviation thinking in the early 1940s. First, there was the assumption that Japanese aviation technology lagged behind Western standards by at least 5 years. This prejudice, rooted in racial stereotypes and outdated intelligence, led American analysts to systematically underestimate Japanese engineering capabilities. Second, American doctrine emphasized ruggedness and firepower over maneuverability. The Navy's primary carrier fighter, the F-4F Wildcat, was built like a flying tank, heavily armored, equipped with 6 50 caliber machine guns, and designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. The idea that an enemy might build an effective fighter using different design priorities simply didn't register as a serious possibility. Third, and perhaps most critically, American fighter pilots in 1941 were trained in tactics developed during World War I and refined in peacetime exercises against other American aircraft. The standard approach to aerial combat emphasized formation flying, coordinated attacks, and energy tactics, using superior speed and dive performance to engage and disengage at will. The concept of turning dogfights, of circling knife fights at close range, was considered outdated, something from the barnstorming era that had no place in modern aerial warfare. The Zero shattered every one of these assumptions within the first weeks of the Pacific War. When the Japanese struck the Philippines on December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, American P-40 Warhawks and P-35 fighters rose to meet them. The American pilots were confident, aggressive, eager to prove their training and their aircraft against an enemy they'd been taught to consider inferior. What followed was a massacre that defied everything they'd been told about aerial combat. The Zeros simply outmaneuvered them, turning inside their turns, climbing above their climbs, staying with them through every desperate evasive maneuver. Experienced American pilots, men who had hundreds of hours in their aircraft, found themselves unable to shake Zero fighters that seemed to pivot in midair, that could climb at angles that looked impossible, that could slow to speeds that should have caused a stall and somehow maintain control. Lieutenant Ed Dias, flying a P-40 over Bataan, described his first encounter with Zeros in terms that captured the psychological shock of the experience. They could turn on a dime and climb almost straight up. If you tried to dogfight with them, you were dead. It was that simple. But the doctrine said you could dogfight, that American fighters were superior, that training and courage would prevail. Dias survived because he abandoned doctrine and ran, using the P-40's superior dive speed to escape. Many of his fellow pilots, trying to fight the way they'd been trained, didn't survive the day. Over the following months, the pattern repeated across the Pacific. At Java, at Rangoon, over Port Moresby, American and Allied pilots encountered the Zero and learned the same brutal lessons. The F-4F Wildcat pilots of the Navy and Marine Corps fared slightly better than their Army Air Force counterparts, but only because they had less power and speed to tempt them into turning engagements. Wildcat pilots learned to fight in defensive circles, using teamwork and their aircraft's ruggedness to survive encounters they couldn't win through maneuverability. The statistics from the early months of the war told a grim story. In the Philippines campaign, Japanese fighters achieved kill ratios of 10-1 or higher. At the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942, Allied air cover proved so ineffective against Zero escorts that naval commanders stopped requesting it. Marine pilots defending Wake Island managed to shoot down several Zeros, but only at catastrophic cost. By the time Wake fell on December 23rd, the Marine fighter squadron had been effectively annihilated. By the spring of 1942, American naval aviation faced a crisis of confidence that went beyond simple tactical disadvantage. Pilots were being sent into combat in aircraft they knew were inferior to the enemy's. Training programs struggled to develop tactics to counter the Zero when the fundamental performance gap seemed unbridgeable. Worst of all, there was a growing sense that Japanese engineering had achieved something American designers couldn't match, that the Zero represented a technological leap that couldn't be countered without completely new aircraft designs. This psychological impact extended beyond the cockpit. Navy planners looking at the strategic situation in the Pacific saw a nightmare scenario. Even if American industry could produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them, what good were carriers if their fighter squadrons couldn't protect them? The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 had stopped the Japanese advance on Port Moresby. but it had also demonstrated that American fighters still couldn't consistently defeat Zeros in air-to-air combat. At Midway in June, American dive bombers had won a decisive victory by catching Japanese carriers with their decks full of aircraft. But the fighter escorts sent to protect those dive bombers had been savaged by Zeros defending the Japanese fleet. Into this crisis came an extraordinary piece of luck, the kind of random chance that intelligence officers dream about but rarely see. On June 4th, 1942, the same day as the Battle of Midway, a Japanese Zero fighter approached Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands as part of Japan's diversionary attack in that theater. The pilot, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, was part of an escort mission when his aircraft took hits from ground fire. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it severed an oil line, and Koga knew he needed to land immediately before his engine seized. He selected what appeared to be a flat, grassy area on Akutan Island, about 25 miles from Dutch Harbor. What Koga couldn't see from altitude was that the flat grass was actually muskeg, a boggy wetland common in the Aleutians that looks solid from above but offers no support for a landing aircraft. When the Zero touched down, it didn't roll to a stop. Instead, it nosed over violently, flipping onto its back and killing Koga instantly when his head struck the instrument panel. The crashed Zero sat on Akutan Island for nearly 5 weeks before a Navy patrol spotted it during a routine search mission. When recovery crews reached the site, they found the aircraft almost completely intact, protected from the elements by the remote location and the circumstances of the crash. More importantly, they found that while Koga had died on impact, the Zero's airframe and engine had sustained minimal damage. This wasn't wreckage to be analyzed in fragments. This was a fully functional enemy fighter that could be restored to flying condition. The aircraft was carefully disassembled, shipped to Naval Air Station San Diego, and reassembled by Navy technicians working under extraordinary security protocols. By early July, less than 5 weeks after Koga's fatal landing, the Zero was ready for flight testing. The Navy selected Commander Eddie Sanders and Lieutenant Commander William Leonard to conduct the initial evaluation flights. Experienced test pilots who understood both the technical requirements of wringing out an unfamiliar aircraft and the tactical implications of what they might discover. Sanders approached his first flight in the captured Zero with the careful respect you'd give any unfamiliar aircraft, but also with the heightened wariness that came from months of reports about what this machine could do in combat. The pre-flight inspection revealed design choices that seemed almost contradictory. The airframe was extraordinarily light, with skin panels thin enough that Sanders could dent them with his thumb. The cockpit was Spartan, lacking even basic amenities like armor protection or self-sealing fuel tanks. The engineering was meticulous in some areas and seemingly crude in others. Sophisticated construction techniques alongside systems that looked hand-fitted rather than mass-produced. The engine was a Nakajima Sakai, a 14-cylinder radial producing just under 1,000 horsepower, significantly less power than the engines in American fighters. Yet the Zero's empty weight was only 3,700 pounds, nearly 1,000 pounds lighter than a Wildcat. This power-to-weight ratio, combined with enormous wing area relative to the aircraft's mass, explained part of the Zero's legendary maneuverability. The aircraft wasn't defying physics. It was simply designed around completely different priorities than American fighters. Sanders's first flight confirmed what combat pilots had been reporting. The Zero was astonishingly agile at low to moderate speeds. It could execute turns that would stall a Wildcat or a P-40. It could climb at angles that seemed to violate common sense. The controls were light and responsive, giving the pilot an almost telepathic connection to the aircraft's movements. For a pilot trained in American fighters, The experience was revelatory and unsettling in equal measure. This wasn't a superior aircraft in the conventional sense. It was an aircraft built according to an entirely different philosophy of what air combat required. But Sanders and Leonard weren't conducting joyrides. They were test pilots, and their mission was to evaluate the Zero systematically across its entire performance envelope. This meant pushing the aircraft to speeds and maneuvers that went beyond what Japanese pilots typically used in combat. It meant testing not just what the Zero could do, but also what it couldn't do, where its performance degraded, where the design compromises that enabled its low-speed agility might create vulnerabilities at other flight regimes. On his third or fourth flight, Sanders decided to conduct a series of high-speed handling tests. He pushed the Zero into a steep dive, building up airspeed beyond what the aircraft would normally reach in level flight or gentle maneuvering. The sockeye engine screamed as the airspeed indicator climbed past 160 knots, then 180, approaching 200 knots. Speeds at which American fighters were just beginning their performance sweet spot, but speeds the Zero rarely saw except in emergency combat situations. At around 200 knots indicated airspeed, Sanders attempted a standard aileron roll to the right, a basic maneuver taught to every fighter pilot, essential for combat maneuvering and evasive action. He applied right aileron pressure, expecting the aircraft to snap into a crisp roll around its longitudinal axis. The Zero barely responded. Sanders increased the aileron pressure, applying more force to the control stick. The aircraft began to roll, but sluggishly, laboriously, as if fighting against some invisible resistance. This wasn't the crisp, immediate response the Zero exhibited at lower speeds. This was an aircraft struggling to execute a fundamental maneuver that any fighter should be able to perform across its speed range. He tried again, this time with maximum aileron deflection. The Zero rolled to the right, but slowly, ponderously. At these speeds, the legendary agility simply vanished, replaced by handling characteristics that felt more like a transport aircraft than a fighter. For a test pilot trained to analyze aircraft behavior systematically, this was an extraordinary discovery. The Zero hadn't just lost some performance at high speed, it had lost a fundamental combat capability. What Sanders had stumbled upon was the consequence of design decisions made by Mitsubishi's engineers years earlier, decisions driven by the specific requirements the Imperial Japanese Navy had established for its carrier-based fighter. The Navy had demanded exceptional range, outstanding maneuverability at combat speeds, and the ability to operate from carriers with limited deck space. To achieve this with the relatively low-powered engines available in the late 1930s, Mitsubishi's design team, led by chief designer Jiro Horikoshi, had made aggressive weight reduction choices throughout the airframe. One of these choices involved the aileron design and control system. To save weight, the Zero's ailerons used fabric covering rather than metal skin, and the control linkages were designed to be as light as possible while still providing adequate control authority at the speeds Japanese doctrine anticipated for turning combat. At 150 knots or below, the speeds where Zeros typically engaged in dogfights, this system worked beautifully, giving pilots the feather-light control response that made the Zero so deadly in circling engagements. But at higher speeds, the aerodynamic forces acting on the fabric-covered ailerons increased exponentially. The fabric would deform under the air pressure, effectively reducing the control surface's authority. Simultaneously, the lightweight control linkages would flex under the pilot's inputs, creating a spongy, indirect feel to the controls. The result was an aircraft that became progressively less responsive in roll as airspeed increased, until at speeds above 200 knots, right rolls became nearly impossible, and left rolls were severely degraded. Sanders documented this phenomenon meticulously over multiple test flights, establishing precise numbers for the Zero's roll rate degradation across different airspeeds. At 140 knots, the Zero could complete a full roll in approximately 2 seconds. At 180 knots, that time stretched to 4 seconds. At 220 knots, a full roll to the right took nearly 7 seconds. An eternity in aerial combat, where positioning advantages could be measured in fractions of a second. The implications of this discovery were immediately obvious to Sanders and the Navy's tactical analysis team. The Zero's vulnerability at high speed wasn't just an interesting technical quirk. It was a tactical weakness that could be systematically exploited by American fighters. If American pilots could be trained to avoid the low-speed turning fights where the Zero excelled, and instead force engagements at higher speeds, where American fighters maintained better control authority, the performance gap that had dominated the first 8 months of the war could be negated. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, already developing innovative fighter tactics aboard the carrier Yorktown before it was sunk at Midway, received the test data from San Diego, while reformulating American fighter doctrine at Naval Air Station North Island. Thatch had survived multiple engagements with Zeros, and had independently concluded that turning dogfights were suicidal for Wildcat pilots. The captured Zero's test results provided the scientific validation for tactics he'd been developing through bitter experience. Teach's analysis was ruthlessly practical. The Wildcat couldn't outturn a Zero, couldn't outclimb a Zero at combat speeds, and couldn't match the Zero's legendary maneuverability in the slow-speed knife fights that Japanese pilots trained for extensively. But the Wildcat could dive faster, could roll better at high speeds, and could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero. The test data from Sanders' flights revealed that above 200 knots, the Wildcat actually had superior roll performance to the Zero, a stunning reversal of the performance relationship at lower speeds. From this analysis emerged what would become known as the Thatch Weave, a tactical formation that used mutual support and high-speed maneuvering to neutralize the Zero's advantages. When a Zero pursued one Wildcat into a firing position, the Wildcat wouldn't try to turn with it. That was death. Instead, the pilot would maintain speed and begin a weaving turn toward his wingman, who would be flying a reciprocal weaving pattern. As the two Wildcats crossed paths, the Zero pilot faced an impossible choice: continue pursuing the original target and accept a head-on shot from the wingman, or break off the attack and lose the advantage. The beauty of the Thatch Weave was that it required the Zero to fight at speeds where it lost its maneuverability advantage. To effectively engage Wildcats using this tactic, Zero pilots had to maintain high closing speeds, which put them precisely in the flight regime where Sanders had discovered their roll authority degradation. A Zero pilot trying to follow a Wildcat through a high-speed weaving turn found his aircraft sluggish and unresponsive, while the Wildcat pilot retained crisp control authority. But tactical innovations required more than just doctrine. They required training, dissemination, and most critically, they required convincing combat pilots to trust new techniques when their lives depended on the outcome. The Navy launched an intensive program to spread the lessons learned from the captured Zero throughout the Fleet Air Arm. Sanders and Leonard conducted demonstration flights, showing naval aviators exactly how the Zero performed and where its weaknesses lay. Technical bulletins were prepared and distributed to every carrier air group in the U.S. Pacific. The challenge was psychological as much as tactical. Pilots who had survived encounters with Zeros had developed deep-seated survival instincts based on avoiding engagement whenever possible. The new doctrine asked them to engage Zeros aggressively, but in a specific way that contradicted their instinctive responses, When a Zero got on your tail, every survival instinct screamed to turn hard, to use every bit of your aircraft's maneuvering capability to shake the enemy. The new tactics required pilots to resist that instinct, to maintain speed, to trust that their wingmen would be there, to believe that the Zero's weakness at high speed was real and exploitable. The first large-scale test of these tactics came at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24, 1942, just 7 weeks after Sanders's initial test flights. The carriers Enterprise and Saratoga faced a Japanese carrier strike force, and for the first time American fighter pilots went into combat with detailed knowledge of the Zero's performance limitations and tactics specifically designed to exploit them. The results were markedly different from earlier engagements. While Zero pilots still achieved kills against American fighters, the exchange ratio had shifted dramatically. Wildcat pilots using the thatch weave and high-speed tactics found they could survive engagements that would have been fatal 2 months earlier. More importantly, they could protect their carriers' bombers more effectively, denying Zero pilots the easy kills they'd achieved in previous battles. Lieutenant Albert "Scoofer" Coffin, flying a Wildcat from the Enterprise, engaged a formation of Zeros escorting Japanese bombers attacking the carrier. Using the tactics drilled into him during training that incorporated the captured Zero's test data, Coffin maintained his speed above 200 knots, refused to be drawn into turning fights, and used coordinated weaves with his section to neutralize the Zero's pursuit curves. He shot down one Zero and damaged another, and more importantly, he survived an engagement that would almost certainly have killed him 3 months earlier. After landing back on Enterprise, Coffin's aircraft was examined by the maintenance crews. It had taken several hits, including a 20-millimeter cannon round that had punched through the armor plate behind his seat. The round had penetrated but not exploded, the kind of damage that would have destroyed a Zero with its lack of armor protection, but which the rugged Wildcat absorbed. The aircraft was repaired and back in service within hours. The tactical revolution wasn't instantaneous or complete. Many pilots still died in engagements with Zeros, and the Zero remained a formidable opponent through the end of the war. But the knowledge base had shifted fundamentally. American pilots no longer approached Zeros with the fatalistic dread of the early war months. They understood their enemy's capabilities and limitations with scientific precision. They had tactics that worked, validated by test data and combat experience. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The captured Zero, designated Koga's Zero after its dead pilot, continued to serve American intelligence throughout 1942 and into 1943. Successive generations of Navy and Marine pilots flew against it in training exercises, learning firsthand how it maneuvered, where it excelled, and where it was vulnerable. Army Air Force pilots preparing for deployment to the Pacific Theater were given detailed briefings based on the test data. The aircraft became perhaps the most valuable single piece of intelligence hardware captured during the entire Pacific War. But the Zero's story didn't end with the discovery of its high-speed handling deficiency. As the war progressed, American engineers and intelligence analysts continued to dissect every aspect of the aircraft's design, seeking additional vulnerabilities that could be exploited tactically or incorporated into American aircraft designs. One discovery proved particularly consequential. The Zero's construction techniques, while producing an extraordinarily light airframe, created critical weaknesses in structural integrity under certain combat loads. The Zero's wing spars were designed with minimal safety margins to save weight. During violent high-G maneuvers, particularly when recovering from high-speed dives, these spars could fail catastrophically. American pilots learned that if they could force a Zero pilot into a high-speed dive, precisely the scenario that negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage. And the Zero pilot attempted a violent pull-up to recover. There was a significant chance the wings would simply fold from the G-forces. This wasn't a guaranteed kill, but it was another tactical option, another way to turn the Zero's design compromises against it. The Navy also discovered that the Zero's lack of self-sealing fuel tanks, while well known from combat reports, was even more critical than initially understood. The fuel system design meant that even minor damage to fuel lines or tanks could cause catastrophic fuel loss or fires. Combined with the lack of armor protection around the cockpit and engine, this made the Zero extraordinarily vulnerable to American .50 caliber machine gun fire, which could penetrate the thin skin and reach vital systems with relative ease. American pilots developed a grim nickname for Zeros that caught fire, flying Zippos, after the popular cigarette lighter. Once a Zero's fuel system was compromised, the aircraft typically had seconds before it became an inferno. Japanese pilots, lacking parachutes in many cases or facing the cultural stigma against surrender, often rode their burning aircraft down rather than bail out. American pilots learned to recognize the specific way a Zero burned, bright, fast, and total, and to verify kills by looking for that characteristic flame pattern. By 1943, the tactical landscape of Pacific air combat had been fundamentally transformed. The Zero was no longer the supreme fighter that had terrorized Allied pilots in the war's opening months. It remained dangerous in the hands of experienced pilots who understood how to leverage its remaining advantages. But American pilots now had comprehensive knowledge of how to counter those advantages and exploit the aircraft's fundamental design weaknesses. This transformation was particularly evident in the results of Operation WWII in April 1943, when the Japanese Navy launched a major air offensive over the Solomons, using their most experienced carrier air groups. These were the elite pilots who had trained before the war, who had combat experience stretching back to China, who understood the Zero's capabilities intimately. They faced American pilots, many relatively inexperienced, flying Wildcats and the newer F-4U Corsairs. The results shocked Japanese commanders. Instead of the overwhelming victories they'd achieved in early 1942, they faced a rough parity in combat, with exchange ratios near 1-to-1 in many engagements. Japanese pilots reported that American fighters were fighting differently, refusing to engage in the turning contests that had been death traps for Allied aircraft a year earlier. The Americans were faster, more aggressive, and seemingly understood exactly how to neutralize Japanese tactical advantages. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, personally flew to Rabaul to observe the air offensive. He reviewed the combat reports, interviewed returning pilots, and reached a sobering conclusion. The qualitative advantage Japanese naval aviation had enjoyed at the war's beginning had evaporated. American pilots had learned how to fight Zeros effectively. American industry was producing fighters in overwhelming numbers, and most ominously, American aircraft design was evolving rapidly to produce fighters that would surpass the Zero in every performance category. Yamamoto's assessment proved prophetic. Within weeks of his visit to Rabaul, American codebreakers intercepted his travel itinerary. On April 18, 1943, Army Air Force P-38 Lightning fighters ambushed Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville and shot it down, killing Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. The P-38s that conducted the intercept represented the new generation of American fighters, faster than the Zero, better armed, with superior high-altitude performance, and the range to conduct missions that would have been impossible for earlier American designs. By mid-1943, the Zero was facing a growing array of American fighters specifically designed to exploit the vulnerabilities Sanders had discovered in his test flights 18 months earlier. The F-6F Hellcat, which began reaching fleet squadrons in early 1943, was essentially an anti-Zero fighter. It had excellent high-speed handling, superior roll rate at all speeds, armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a robust structure that could absorb tremendous battle damage. In the hands of a competent pilot using proper tactics, the Hellcat was nearly unstoppable against Zeros. The combat statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, before the captured Zero's lessons were fully disseminated, Japanese naval aviators achieved kill ratios in the Pacific that sometimes exceeded 10-1. By late 1943, with Hellcats entering service and tactics fully evolved, those ratios had reversed. American fighters were achieving kill ratios of 15-1 or higher in major engagements. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944 saw American carrier fighters destroy over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day, with American losses in the single digits. The Zero's designers at Mitsubishi understood the aircraft's obsolescence and attempted to develop improved variants. The A6M model, introduced in late 1943, had strengthened wings, improved diving performance, and slightly better high-speed handling. The A6M8, which appeared in 1945, incorporated rudimentary armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. But these improvements came too late and did too little. The fundamental design philosophy that had made the Zero dominant in 1941, extreme lightness, maximum maneuverability, extended range, had become a fatal liability against American fighters designed specifically to negate those advantages. More critically, Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce the newer, heavier fighters that could compete with American designs on equal terms. While the United States was mass-producing Hellcats, Corsairs, and P-38 Lightnings by the thousands, Japan struggled to maintain production of any aircraft type. Factories were bombed, raw materials became scarce, and the pool of skilled workers and experienced pilots dwindled catastrophically. By 1945, Japanese pilots were going into combat with minimal training, often in obsolete aircraft, facing American pilots with hundreds of hours of flight time in superior fighters. The pilot who never knew the Zero's secret was Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, who died instantly when his aircraft flipped on Akutan Island. His death was recorded in Japanese records as killed in action, with no indication that his aircraft had been recovered. The Japanese Navy never learned that their most advanced fighter had fallen into American hands intact, never understood that every tactical and technical secret of the Zero had been systematically analyzed and disseminated to Allied forces. Koga was 24 years old when he died, an experienced pilot with combat time over China and in the opening months of the Pacific War. He came from a family with a long tradition of military service, had trained at the Yokaran Flight School, and by all accounts was an excellent aviator. His decision to attempt a landing on Akutan Island rather than ditch in the ocean was tactically sound. The ocean would have destroyed the aircraft, while even a rough field landing offered a chance of survival and possible recovery. The irony is profound. Koga died trying to preserve his aircraft, and in doing so, he handed the Americans the intelligence that would help destroy Japanese naval aviation. His choice to land rather than ditch was brave and by the book. It was also, in retrospect, one of the most consequential individual actions of the Pacific Air War, though neither he nor his commanders could have known it at the time. For Commander Eddie Sanders, the test pilot who discovered the Zero's rolling deficiency, the captured aircraft represented the pinnacle of his contribution to the war effort. His careful, methodical test flights provided the hard data that transformed American fighter tactics. He flew the Zero dozens of times, wringing out every aspect of its performance, documenting everything with the precision that separates professional test flying from ordinary aviation. His reports were distributed throughout the Navy's fighter community, formed the basis for tactical bulletins, and directly influenced the training of thousands of American naval aviators. Sanders survived the war and continued his career as a test pilot, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. In later interviews, he was characteristically modest about his role, noting that he'd simply done the job test pilots are trained to do: evaluate an aircraft systematically and report the findings accurately. But the impact of those findings resonated far beyond the test programs at San Diego. They represented a turning point in the Pacific Air War, the moment when psychological advantage shifted from Japan to the United States. The captured Zero itself met an ignominious end in February 1945, destroyed in a training accident when a pilot unfamiliar with its handling characteristics stalled during a demonstration flight and crashed on landing. By that point, the aircraft had served its purpose many times over. Its secrets had been thoroughly documented, its tactics fully understood, and American fighters had long since evolved beyond needing to study captured examples to understand their enemy. But the legacy of Koga's Zero extended well beyond tactical innovations. The aircraft demonstrated to American aviation engineers that radically different design philosophies could produce effective combat aircraft. The Zero's emphasis on range and maneuverability at the expense of protection and high-speed performance represented a coherent engineering approach, even if it was ultimately one that proved vulnerable to systematic exploitation. This lesson influenced American aircraft design in subtle but important ways. The P-51 Mustang, which became the dominant American fighter in Europe by 1944, combined British and American design philosophies to create an aircraft with exceptional range, good maneuverability, and robust construction. The Mustang's designers understood that you didn't have to sacrifice everything for one performance characteristic. Careful engineering could produce an aircraft that excelled across multiple parameters. This represented an evolution in thinking directly influenced by analysis of the Zero's strengths and weaknesses. The psychological transformation of American naval aviation between December 1941 and late 1942 represents one of the more remarkable turnarounds in military history. In 8 months, the Navy went from near despair about its fighter capabilities to confidence based on scientific understanding and proven tactics. The captured Zero provided the Rosetta Stone that decoded Japanese air superiority. What makes this transformation particularly striking is that it occurred without any fundamental changes to American frontline fighters. The Wildcats that fought at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 were essentially the same aircraft that had fought at Wake Island and Java earlier that year. What changed wasn't the hardware, it was the knowledge base, the tactical doctrine, and the psychological approach to combat. American pilots learned to fight smarter rather than harder, to use their aircraft's actual strengths rather than trying to match the enemy in areas where they were outmatched. This pattern would repeat throughout the Pacific War. At Guadalcanal, American pilots in Wildcats and Army P-39s and P-38s faced Japanese bombers and fighters in brutal daily air battles. The American aircraft weren't technically superior. In many cases, they were inferior to their Japanese counterparts in pure performance terms. But American pilots understood how to negate Japanese advantages, how to force engagements into flight regimes where American aircraft maintained superiority, and how to use teamwork and tactics to overcome individual aircraft limitations. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to the changing tactical environment. Their doctrine remained focused on individual pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability, the approaches that had brought overwhelming success in the war's opening months. When those approaches began failing against evolved American tactics, the Japanese aviation establishment lacked the institutional flexibility to develop effective counters. Pilots were still trained to dogfight, still emphasized turning performance over energy management, still flew aircraft optimized for close-range combat rather than the high-speed, hit-and-run tactics that American fighters were perfecting. This doctrinal rigidity cost Japan catastrophically in pilot losses. Japanese naval aviation entered the war with approximately 3,000 highly trained carrier pilots, veterans of years of intensive training and often combat experience in China. By the end of 1943, the vast majority of these men were dead. They died over Guadalcanal, over New Guinea, over the Solomons, killed by American pilots who understood their aircraft's weaknesses and knew how to exploit them. Japan's training program couldn't replace these losses effectively. As the war progressed, the quality of Japanese pilots declined precipitously, while American training programs were producing thousands of competent aviators annually. By 1944, many Japanese carrier pilots had less than 100 hours of total flight time, barely enough to fly the aircraft safely, much less employ it effectively in combat against experienced American pilots in superior fighters. The final testament to the captured Zero's impact came at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the engagement American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese carrier aviation launched its last major offensive against American forces, sending over 400 aircraft against the American Fast Carrier Task Force. They faced F-6F Hellcats, flown by pilots thoroughly trained in anti-Zero tactics, flying aircraft specifically designed to negate the Zero's advantages. The result was annihilation. American fighters destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day of combat. American losses totaled approximately 20 aircraft. The exchange ratio exceeded 15-1. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered from this catastrophic defeat. The elite pilots were gone, the aircraft were obsolete, and the industrial capacity to rebuild had been destroyed by American submarines and strategic bombing. Watching this slaughter from the bridges of their carriers, Japanese naval officers understood that the qualitative advantage they'd enjoyed at Pearl Harbor had been completely reversed. American fighters were superior, American pilots were better trained, American tactics were more effective, and American industrial production was simply overwhelming. The war in the air was effectively over, even though another year of brutal fighting remained before Japan's surrender. The ridiculous test that showed the Zero couldn't roll right above 200 knots, the seemingly trivial handling characteristic that Commander Sanders documented on a sunny July morning in 1942, had revealed a vulnerability that cascaded through the entire structure of Japanese naval aviation. It wasn't just about roll rate. It was about design philosophy, tactical doctrine, training methods, and strategic planning. The Zero represented Japan's approach to the Pacific War: achieve early, overwhelming success through superior skill and specialized equipment, then leverage that advantage to achieve victory before the enemy could adapt. The captured Zero proved that adaptation was possible, that American pilots could learn and evolve faster than Japanese doctrine could respond. It demonstrated that the material advantage of American industry, the rugged aircraft, the comprehensive training, the overwhelming production capacity, could overcome initial tactical and qualitative disadvantages given enough time and accurate intelligence. For the American naval aviators who faced Zeros in combat during the war's middle and late phases, the knowledge that came from Koga's aircraft was quite literally life-saving. They went into battle, understanding their enemy's capabilities with scientific precision. They knew exactly where the Zero was deadly and where it was vulnerable. They had tactics proven in test flights and validated in combat. This knowledge transformed them from victims of Japanese air superiority into masters of the Pacific skies. The cost of acquiring this knowledge: the hundreds of pilots killed in the war's first 8 months while American aviation struggled to understand what it faced, weighs heavily in the historical record. The fighters lost at Wake, at Java, over the Philippines and Burma, died facing an enemy whose capabilities they couldn't match and didn't fully understand. The tactical revolution that came from the captured Zero arrived too late for them. But their deaths weren't meaningless. The combat reports these pilots filed before being shot down, the tactical observations they radioed to their carriers before being overwhelmed, the insights they shared during brief respites between missions. All of this contributed to the knowledge base that the captured Zero validated and expanded. They learned through bitter experience what Sanders would later prove through systematic testing: that the Zero was vulnerable in specific ways, that American aircraft had compensating advantages, that victory required fighting smarter rather than matching the enemy's strengths. The broader lesson extends beyond the specifics of World War II aerial combat. The captured Zero demonstrated that understanding your enemy's actual capabilities, as opposed to assumptions based on prejudice, incomplete intelligence, or wishful thinking, represents a strategic advantage that can compensate for tactical disadvantages. The American military entered the Pacific War with profound misconceptions about Japanese capabilities, misconceptions rooted in racism, outdated intelligence, and peacetime complacency. Those misconceptions cost thousands of lives. The systematic analysis of the captured Zero forced American military leadership to confront reality. Japanese engineers had designed an excellent fighter aircraft using a coherent engineering philosophy. Japanese pilots were skilled, brave, and tactically proficient. Japanese industry could produce effective weapon systems. Acknowledging these truths didn't mean accepting defeat. It meant developing responses based on accurate assessment rather than comfortable assumptions. This represents a fundamental principle of effective strategy. Respect your enemy's actual capabilities while understanding your own genuine advantages. American aviation's advantages weren't in aircraft maneuverability or pilot agility. They were in industrial production, training capacity, technological innovation, and the ability to adapt doctrine based on systematic analysis. Playing to these strengths required abandoning the fantasy that American aircraft were inherently superior and American pilots naturally better than their Japanese counterparts. The captured Zero provided the evidence base for this strategic reorientation. It proved that Japanese aircraft design was sophisticated and effective within its design parameters. It also proved that those design parameters created specific vulnerabilities that could be systematically exploited. This knowledge allowed American aviation to stop trying to beat the Japanese at their own game and instead force the Japanese to fight on American terms. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.